Beneath the quiet charm of medieval cities, where tourists now stroll past ancient cathedrals and bustling market squares, lies a hidden world of military genius, forgotten masterpieces of engineering that once decided the fate of kingdoms. Imagine walking those same cobblestone streets, unaware that just beneath your feet, labyrinths of tunnels, chambers, and traps lie dormant, waiting to whisper their secrets. These weren't just simple fortifications. They were the cutting-edge technology of their time, designed to outwit sieges, repel invaders, and turn the tide of war with nothing but sheer ingenuity. And yet, most of these marvels have faded into obscurity, buried by centuries of dust and legend. Until now, today, we're pulling back the veil on 30 of history's most astonishing military engineering feats. Structures so clever, so audacious, they'll make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval warfare. Picture floodable moats that could drown an army in minutes, secret passages that allowed defenders to vanish into thin air, and towering walls engineered to collapse onto attackers at the perfect moment. These weren't just buildings, they were psychological weapons designed to terrify and confuse, and the minds behind them, masterminds who combined artistry with brute force, turning stone and water into instruments of survival. But this isn't just a tour of ancient ruins, it's a journey into the heart of human resilience. Every tunnel, every hidden gate, every cleverly disguised murder hole tells a story of communities fighting for their lives, of engineers who pushed the limits of what was possible with nothing but fire, chisel, and sheer determination. So come with us as we descend into the shadows, where the echoes of clashing swords and whispered strategies still linger. By the end, you'll see these medieval cities not just as relics of the past, but as monuments to the unyielding creativity of the human spirit. The ground beneath us is about to reveal its secrets. Are you ready to uncover them? The towering walls of Carcasson might steal the spotlight, but the real magic happened underground. Imagine enemy forces camped outside those famous ramparts, confident they could starve the city into surrender, only to discover too late that defenders were moving freely beneath their feet. A labyrinth of tunnels snaked through the bedrock, connecting strategic points like hidden arteries. Some passages led to secret exits beyond the siege lines, letting soldiers slip out like ghosts to ambush attackers or bring in supplies. Others funneled fresh water from deep reservoirs, ensuring the city could outlast any blockade. But the true stroke of genius, engineers expanded natural cave systems, creating a disorienting maze where invaders who breached the walls would find themselves lost in darkness, chased by echoes of shifting gravel, the sound of defenders materializing from nowhere. This wasn't just survival, it was psychological warfare. The mere knowledge that the ground itself might come alive kept besieging armies restless, their morale crumbling long before their siege engines did. And when attackers finally retreated, the tunnels could be sealed with cleverly disguised stonework, leaving no trace for the next army to study. Carcassonne's underground network was so effective, it became a blueprint for fortified cities across Europe. But water, as it turns out, could be an even deadlier tool in medieval engineering arsenals. While towering walls and arrow loops were the visible defenses of medieval castles, some of the deadliest traps lay hidden beneath the water's surface. At Carefilly Castle in Wales, engineers didn't just dig a moat, they weaponized it. Picture an advancing army, their siege towers rolling toward the walls, only for the ground to suddenly vanish beneath a surging tide. With a few swift turns of hidden sluice gates, defenders could transform calm waters into a drowning machine, flooding the battlefield in minutes. The genius wasn't just in the water's force, but in its precision. Channels carved into the landscape acted like valves, letting engineers control the depth with terrifying accuracy. Too shallow, and attackers might wade through. Too deep, and the castle's own foundations could be undermined. But at just the right level, siege engines would bog down, armor would become a death sentence, and any soldier caught in the deluge would struggle against currents designed to pull them under. What made Carefilly's moat truly revolutionary was its psychological impact. Armies learned to fear not just the water itself, but the uncertainty, the knowledge that dry ground could become a death trap at any moment. This forced attackers into lengthy, grinding sieges, buying the castle's defenders precious time. And when the waters finally receded, they left behind a quagmire of churned mud, making any renewed assault nearly impossible. Today, the moat's calm surface gives no hint of its lethal past, but the math still speaks volumes. Carefilly was besieged repeatedly, yet never taken by force. Its secret, a mastery of hydraulics so advanced, it would take centuries for military engineering to match its sophistication again. Yet even this watery marvel paled in comparison to the horrors awaiting invaders who dared to enter the tunnels beneath Malta's Fort St. Angelo. At Château de Kousie, beauty was the ultimate disguise. Visitors admiring the castle's grand archways and ornate carvings would never suspect the deadly secret hidden in plain sight. Those intricate patterns overhead weren't just decoration. They concealed murder holes engineered to rain destruction the moment attackers crossed the threshold. Picture an invading force charging through the gates, only for the ceiling above them to suddenly erupt with boiling oil, jagged rocks, or a hail of crossbow bolts. The defenders, safe behind layers of stone, could pick their targets with chilling precision, turning every entrance into a slaughterhouse without ever facing their enemies directly. What made Kousie's murder holes so terrifying wasn't just the violence, it was the unpredictability. Some openings were designed to drop quicklime, a caustic powder that blinded and suffocated anyone caught beneath it. Others funneled scalding water, which couldn't be blocked by shields or armor. And the real genius, the holes were spaced just far enough apart to force attackers into tight groups, maximizing each drop's carnage. This wasn't brute force, it was mathematical cruelty, turning architecture itself into a weapon. But the psychological impact ran deeper. Survivors of these assaults brought back horror stories, spreading fear far beyond the castle walls. Future invaders would hesitate at every gateway, their eyes darting upward, knowing death could fall from nowhere. That hesitation bought defenders precious seconds, sometimes enough to rally reinforcements or seal inner defenses. Kousie's engineers understood something modern militaries still rely on. The best defenses don't just kill, they paralyze with doubt. Yet even these nightmarish traps were just one piece of a larger puzzle. While castles like Kousie perfected the art of killing from above, entire cities were engineering something far more ambitious beneath their streets, hidden networks capable of moving not just oil or arrows, but entire armies unseen. Deep beneath the volcanic rock of Kapadocia, an entire army could vanish without a trace, not into thin air, but into the earth itself. Durin wasn't just a hiding place. It was a subterranean fortress engineered to outlast any siege, sheltering thousands of soldiers across 8 sprawling levels that plunged nearly 200 feet into the ground. Picture an invading force scouring the countryside, convinced their enemies had fled, while beneath their feet, a bustling underground city thrived. Fresh air flowed through meticulously carved ventilation shafts, disguised on the surface as innocent wells. Gigantic circular stone doors, each weighing half a ton, could roll into place at a moment's notice, cutting off entire sections to trap or slow attackers. And if enemies dared to follow, the tunnels narrowed deliberately, forcing them into single file, where one defender with a spear could hold off an entire column. But Durin Kousie's true brilliance lay in its self-sufficiency. Vast chambers stored enough grain and wine to last months. Ingenious water wells tapped into underground streams while preventing poison attempts with labyrinthine filtration systems. Even livestock lived in specially designed stables, their waste funneled through channels to keep the air breathable. This wasn't just survival, it was a masterclass in psychological dominance. Above ground, invaders would grow desperate, wasting resources searching for an enemy that had seemingly disappeared. Meanwhile, below, life carried on. Soldiers trained in torchlit halls, blacksmiths repaired weapons, and commanders plotted counterattacks from map rooms carved into the rock. The city's design exploited every natural advantage. Soft volcanic tuff made excavation easier but hardened when exposed to air, creating structures that withstood centuries. Vertical communication shafts allowed messages to travel between levels faster than any courier could run. And if all else failed, secret escape tunnels stretched for miles, emerging hidden in distant valleys. Durin Kousie wasn't just a refuge, it was a chessboard where medieval engineers turned the very landscape into their pawn. Yet what's most astonishing isn't the scale, it's the silence. Unlike towering castles that announced their might, Durin Kousie's power lay in its invisibility. No siege engines could breach walls that didn't exist above ground. No fires could smoke out defenders when the wind itself was engineered to obey. This was warfare stripped down to its purest elements, patience against fury, shadow against steel. And when the time was right, those hidden thousands could surge upward like a geyser, transforming from hunted to hunters in the blink of an eye. But darkness wasn't just a shield, it could be a blade. As we'll see next, some medieval architects took this concept even further, crafting tunnels that didn't just hide defenders, but actively lured invaders to their doom. In the suffocating darkness beneath Maastricht, medieval engineers turned the absence of light into their greatest weapon. These weren't just tunnels, they were carefully crafted nightmares designed to prey on every primal fear an invading soldier carried underground. Picture armored men squeezing through passages so narrow they could barely lift their swords, their torches snuffed out by defenders waiting in the shadows. Every footstep echoed unnaturally off walls angled to distort sound, making whispers seem close and shouts appear distant. The floor, a treachery of uneven stones, some loose enough to send attackers tumbling into pits lined with spikes, others sloping subtly toward dead ends where crossbow bolts would find them before they realized their mistake. What made Maastricht's tunnels so devastating wasn't just the physical traps, it was the psychological unraveling. Defenders, barefoot and clad in dark cloth, moved silently through side passages they'd memorized since childhood. A sudden shove here, a dagger between armor gaps there, and then they'd melt back into the blackness, leaving invaders to panic. Some alcoves hid ropes rigged to trip mechanisms, dropping weighted nets or triggering false rockfalls that sent attackers scrambling in terror. The genius lay in the imbalance. Every advantage an army had above ground, numbers, weapons, armor, meant nothing when you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. But the real mastery, engineers exploited human nature itself. After hours in that endless dark, even seasoned soldiers would hallucinate sounds, attack their own allies, or abandon formation to flee only to circle back to the same traps. Surviving invaders spoke of the breathing walls, convinced the tunnels themselves were alive. Maastricht's defenders understood something modern special forces still practice today. Darkness isn't just an absence of light. It's a weapon that turns courage into dread, discipline into chaos, and when the occasional survivor stumbled back into daylight, their horror stories did more to deter future attacks than any wall ever could. Yet while Maastricht weaponized the Earth's depths, another city took defense engineering in the opposite direction literally. High above the streets of San Gimignano, towers weren't just symbols of wealth. They were a skyline transformed into a fortress. High above the battlefield, enemy commanders thought they held every advantage until the Earth itself began to spit fire. Crac des Chevaliers, the mighty Crusader fortress, didn't just defy sieges, it reversed them. Deep beneath its towering walls, engineers had carved shafts angled upward like volcanic vents, each housing a hidden catapult loaded with stones or flaming pitch. Picture an attacking army scaling the hillside, confident that elevation would give them the upper hand, only for the ground beneath their feet to suddenly erupt. Projectiles launched from below shattered formations, sending soldiers tumbling downhill in chaos. The psychological shock was as devastating as the physical blows. No medieval tactician had trained for an assault that came from beneath their boots. What made these reverse siege engines truly revolutionary was their camouflage. When not in use, the firing ports were covered with slabs of limestone, meticulously carved and weathered to blend seamlessly with the cliff face. Even scouts inspecting the fortress at close range saw only natural rock, but the moment attackers massed on the slopes above, defenders could trigger the mechanisms with a system of ropes and pulleys, turning the hillside into a killing zone. The genius lay in the angles. Each catapult was calibrated to launch its payload in a high arc, dropping stones directly onto the heads of enemies who thought they were safely out of range. This wasn't just innovation, it was deception on a grand scale. Crac's engineers exploited the universal assumption that danger came from above or straight ahead. By weaponizing the ground itself, they turned the high ground into a fatal trap. Historical accounts describe besieging armies abandoning their positions in panic, convinced the fortress was protected by supernatural forces. And long after the dust settled, the legend of Crac's earthborne artillery spread like wildfire, deterring future attacks before they even began. Yet sound could be just as disorienting as any hidden catapult. While Crac's defenders mastered the art of subterranean warfare, other medieval strongholds discovered how to weaponize noise itself, turning echoes and vibrations into instruments of terror. The moment an invader's boot touched the stone floors of Dover Castle's secret tunnels, the walls themselves began to betray them. Hidden chambers, carved with mathematically precise curves, transformed every footstep into thunderous echoes that traveled far ahead of the attackers. Picture a squad of elite soldiers creeping forward in near silence, only for their movements to reverberate through the rock like a drumbeat, alerting defenders long before they came into view. But the real stroke of genius wasn't just amplification, it was deception. Curved walls bent sound waves in unnatural ways, making a single soldier's step seem to come from 3 directions at once. Invaders would spin in circles, swords raised at empty air, while archers above listened calmly to pinpoint their true location through subtle vibrations in hidden listening posts. Some passages took this auditory warfare even further, functioning as medieval versions of modern whispering galleries. A defender murmuring into one curved wall could send their voice snaking through half a mile of tunnels, reaching allies with crystal clarity, while invaders just feet away heard only indistinct murmurs. This allowed Dover's garrison to coordinate counterattacks in total silence, their communications hidden in plain sound. The psychological toll was devastating. Historical accounts describe seasoned knights freezing mid-step, terrified that the very stones were gossiping about their position. What set Dover apart was how these acoustic tricks complemented its physical defenses. murder holes positioned above sound-amplifying chambers let defenders drop projectiles with eerie precision, seemingly responding to noises no human could normally detect. False corridors, dead-ending abruptly, would bounce back the frustrated shouts of lost invaders straight to waiting crossbowmen. Even the castle's famous stairwells spiraled clockwise, not just for sword-fighting advantage, but because the tight curves amplified the metallic clatter of ascending armor, turning each step into a clanging alarm. Yet perhaps the most chilling innovation was how Dover's engineers weaponized silence itself. Certain tunnels were lined with layers of sheep's wool behind thin stone veneers, creating pockets of unnatural quiet where defenders could wait undetected. Attackers chasing echoes would suddenly find themselves in tomb-like stillness, their own breathing deafening in the absence of reverberation. This sensory whiplash, from deafening echoes to utter silence, left even veteran soldiers disoriented long enough for hidden doors to swing shut behind them, trapping entire companies in darkness. While Dover mastered the art of auditory deception, another city took invisibility to astonishing new heights, not through sound but through sheer disappearance. Beneath the rolling hills of Orvieto, an entire civilization could evaporate before an invader's eyes. At first glance, the tidal flats surrounding Mont Saint-Michel seemed like nothing more than a scenic quirk of nature until the waters rose and the city's streets began to vanish before an invader's eyes. Medieval engineers here didn't just build defenses, they choreographed the sea itself, transforming the daily rhythm of the tides into an impenetrable shield. Picture an attacking army surging across the exposed seabed at low tide, only to find the causeways behind them collapsing into the waves as defenders retracted hidden counterweights. Within minutes, what had been solid ground became a swirling trap, isolating invaders on shrinking islands of stone as the relentless channel waters swallowed every escape route. The genius of Mont Saint-Michel's design lay in its precision timing. Engineers studied tidal patterns for generations, mapping the exact moments when specific streets would flood, not just with water but with purpose. Some pathways were built slightly lower than others, ensuring the sea would cut off retreat before surrounding the main gates. Others featured removable wooden planks that could be yanked away in seconds, leaving attackers stranded on unstable sandbars. Even the city's famous ramparts were angled to deflect incoming waves, creating artificial currents that could sweep unwary soldiers off their feet. This wasn't just fortification. It was environmental warfare, turning the moon's gravitational pull into an ally. But the real terror for besiegers wasn't the water, it was the silence. Unlike the crashing violence of a storm surge, Mont Saint-Michel's flooding happened with eerie calm. One moment, invaders might be regrouping in a seemingly secure courtyard. The next, they'd notice the first icy fingers of seawater lapping at their boots. By the time they sounded the alarm, escape routes would already be submerged, their siege engines slowly toppling sideways into the rising tide. Defenders, safe on elevated walkways they alone knew how to navigate, watched as nature did their work for them. Historical accounts describe besieging armies abandoning their armor in panicked attempts to swim, only to be caught in the relentless pull of the tides, their heavy weapons dragging them under. The few who survived brought back tales of a city that seemed to will itself into isolation, defying the very laws of geography. And when the waters eventually receded, they left behind not just broken siege equipment, but something far more dangerous to future attackers: legend. Word spread that Mont Saint-Michel wasn't merely protected by the sea, it commanded it. Yet water wasn't the only element medieval engineers weaponized with such chilling precision. As the tides around Mont Saint-Michel proved, nature could be harnessed, but fire could be sculpted into something far more terrifying. The streets of Rhodes looked deceptively peaceful until defenders unleashed hell itself from below. Hidden beneath the city's cobblestones, a network of trenches filled with viscous, flammable oil lay waiting like a sleeping dragon. Picture an invading army pouring through the gates, only for the ground beneath them to suddenly erupt in geysers of fire. Defenders, safe behind fortified control rooms, operated a system of sluice gates that transformed these channels into precise instruments of terror. With a single signal, they could ignite entire districts, creating walls of flame that advanced like living things, herding attackers into killing zones where crossbowmen waited. The heat was so intense, contemporary accounts describe metal breastplates melting onto soldiers' bodies, while wooden siege towers caught fire like matchsticks. But the true brilliance of Rhodes' fire trenches wasn't just their destructive power. It was their surgical control. Engineers designed the channels to branch like rivers, allowing defenders to steer flames with terrifying accuracy. Some trenches fed directly beneath siege engine staging areas, ensuring the very tools meant to breach the walls became infernos. Others ran parallel to major thoroughfares, creating corridors of fire that forced invaders into narrow alleys where boiling oil could be poured from above. The system even accounted for wind patterns, with secondary trenches positioned to spread flames against the breeze, creating unpredictable surges that outflanked anyone attempting to retreat. What made this defense so psychologically devastating was its unpredictability. Attackers never knew which street might suddenly become a furnace, or whether the ground they stood on concealed a trench about to ignite. Survivors spoke of flames that seemed to chase them, as if the city itself had come alive with rage. And when the fires finally died down, Rhodes engineers could reset the entire system in hours, refilling trenches from hidden reservoirs, repairing sluice gates, and leaving no trace of the horror for the next wave of invaders to anticipate. Yet while Rhodes mastered the art of turning streets into bonfires, another fortress took subterranean warfare to an even more astonishing extreme. Far beneath the cliffs of Nottingham, engineers didn't just hide defenders, they built an entire castle that could disappear beneath the earth. High in the Sri Lankan jungle, invaders scaling the cliffs of Sigiriya thought they had finally reached the fortress gates, until the mountain itself began to rearrange before their eyes. With a thunderous groan of stone, entire sections of the citadel's walls would suddenly sink into the earth, vanishing as if swallowed by the ground. One moment, attackers might be pressing forward through a narrow corridor. The next, they'd find themselves stranded in an open courtyard, exposed on all sides as new walls erupted from hidden slots to cut off their retreat. This wasn't just architecture, it was theater of war where the stage itself conspired against the enemy. The secret lay in a network of underground chambers housing massive counterweights, each connected to the walls above by ropes woven from coconut fiber and buffalo hide. Teams of defenders could trigger these mechanisms with startling speed, using lever systems to shift multi-ton stone blocks like pieces on a chessboard. Some walls slid horizontally to create fresh choke points, while others dropped vertically to reveal previously hidden archer platforms. The effect was a fortress in constant metamorphosis, where no two assaults ever played out the same way. But the true cruelty of Sigiriya's design wasn't just the physical traps, it was the psychological torment. Attackers would meticulously map a route during reconnaissance, only to find their plans worthless as familiar landmarks disappeared. Courtyards that seemed safe for regrouping could transform into killing zones in minutes, with murder holes opening in newly aligned walls to rain down arrows. Even the fortress's famous lion's paw staircase, a monumental entrance carved between giant stone claws, could be severed mid-ascent, leaving invaders clinging to a collapsing cliff face. What made this system revolutionary was its sustainability. Unlike boiling oil or fire trenches that required constant resupply, Sigiria's moving walls needed only manpower to reset. The counterweights operated on simple physics, allowing small teams to manipulate defenses that felt like the work of giants. And when the battle ended, the walls could be silently repositioned to their original state, leaving no trace of the labyrinth that had just devoured an army. Survivors brought back tales of a living fortress that breathed like a beast, its stone ribs expanding and contracting at will. Modern archaeologists have found evidence that some walls were even designed to produce eerie harmonic vibrations when moved, an auditory flourish meant to unsettle invaders already doubting their senses. Sigiria proved that the best defenses weren't just strong, they were unpredictable, turning the very concept of siege warfare into a deadly game of musical chairs where the music stopped without warning. Yet while Sigiria's engineers mastered the art of shifting stone, others discovered how to make the earth itself tremble beneath an enemy's feet. Beneath the ancient streets of Tyre, invaders soon learned that every footstep could be their last. What appeared to be ordinary tunnels, damp, cramped passageways leading toward the city's heart, were actually meticulously engineered death traps, rigged to collapse at the touch of a hidden lever. Picture an advancing column of armored soldiers, their torches flickering against walls that seemed solid, unaware that the very stones above them balanced on a knife's edge. With a single pull of a disguised chain, perhaps hidden in a seemingly decorative wall carving or a loose floor tile, defenders could send tons of rubble crashing down, burying entire battalions in an instant. But the true horror of Tyre's tunnels wasn't just the sudden collapses, it was the cruel sequencing. Engineers designed certain passages to collapse in stages, like a macabre domino effect. Invaders who survived the first cave-in would instinctively retreat, only to find the tunnel behind them now blocked, herding them deeper into the labyrinth. Panicked, they'd rush forward, stumbling into the next pre-weakened section where another trigger awaited. This wasn't just destruction, it was a calculated game of predator and prey, where the walls themselves seemed to conspire against the invaders. Some tunnels took the deception even further, incorporating decoy supports, beams that looked sturdy but would splinter under the slightest pressure. Others featured false floors, their surfaces indistinguishable from solid stone, until the weight of a dozen soldiers triggered a collapse into pits lined with jagged debris. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Survivors told of companions vanishing mid-sentence, swallowed by the earth without warning, their screams muffled under cascading rock. What made Tyre's system so effective was its simplicity. Unlike complex machinery that could fail, these traps relied on gravity and clever geometry. Release mechanisms were camouflaged as mundane features: a statue's outstretched arm, a rusted sconce, even a seemingly random crack in the wall. Defenders could activate them silently from hidden alcoves or even distant control rooms, leaving invaders with no one to fight but the architecture itself. Yet while Tyre turned its tunnels into tombs, other cities discovered far fouler uses for their underground passages. When sewers weren't carrying waste, they could be weaponized, flooded with more than just water. The cobbled streets of medieval York hid a weapon so revolting, it turned the city's very waste into a siege-breaking nightmare. Beneath those picturesque lanes, engineers had crafted a network of pressurized pipes that didn't just carry sewage, they weaponized it. Imagine an attacking force breaching the outer walls, only to be met with geysers of foul liquid erupting from grates underfoot. The force alone could knock armored knights off their feet, but the real horror came after. This wasn't just water, it was a stew of human waste, rotting food, and whatever else the city had flushed away, deliberately funneled into high-pressure channels that could drench entire battalions in seconds. What made York's system so brutally effective wasn't just the discussed factor, it was the science. defenders added quicklime to the mix, creating a corrosive slurry that ate through leather straps and metal hinges, leaving armor useless and skin blistered. The stench clung to everything, seeping into clothing and wounds, ensuring even those who escaped the initial deluge faced infection. Contemporary accounts describe besiegers abandoning their positions not from injury, but from the unbearable stink that followed them for weeks, a putrid calling card no amount of scrubbing could erase. But the true genius lay in the pipe's design. Unlike simple drains, these were engineered with tapered nozzles and sluice gates that could direct torrents with terrifying precision. Some outlets angled upward to create arcs of filth that rained down on siege towers, while others shot horizontally to sweep charging infantry off their feet. The system even accounted for wind direction. Defenders waited for gusts to carry the spray farther, turning breezes into biological weapons. The psychological impact was immeasurable. Stories spread of invaders vomiting mid-charge, their weapons slipping from greasy hands. Others deserted rather than face what they called the devil's broth, convinced such humiliation couldn't be mere engineering. York's defenders understood something modern militaries still grapple with. Sometimes the most effective weapons aren't the deadliest, but the ones that break the enemy's will to fight. Yet while York turned waste into warfare, another fortress was perfecting a far more incendiary tactic, one that didn't just repel invaders, but consumed them in flames. Malbork Castle's gates didn't just intimidate, they breathed fire. Hidden inside its towering gatehouses, iron nozzles lined the arches like the teeth of some sleeping beast, waiting for the moment defenders yanked a lever to awaken them. Underground reservoirs fed these monstrous flamethrowers with enough oil to sustain walls of flame for hours, turning approach roads into infernos. The system wasn't just deadly, it was theatrical. Attackers would hear a deep, guttural roar as pressurized fuel ignited, followed by a jet of fire so intense it could melt the lead in stained glass windows 50 feet away. Survivors swore the flames seemed alive, twisting and lunging as if guided by some malevolent intelligence. But the Dragon's Maw, as it came to be known, wasn't just about raw destruction. Engineers designed it to exploit human instinct. The initial burst targeted the ground, not the soldiers igniting spilled oil to create an advancing fire line that forced attackers to either retreat into arrow fire or charge blindly through the flames. The real cruelty lay in the timing. Defenders could let the first wave of invaders cross the threshold before activating the maw, trapping them between fire behind and falling portcullises ahead. Even the castle's stonework played a role. Special heat-resistant mortar prevented the intense temperatures from damaging the structure, while angled walls reflected the flames outward like a bellows. What made Malbork's system legendary was its psychological resonance. Medieval minds already associated castles with mythical beasts, dragons guarding treasure, griffins perched on towers. To see those legends manifest in jets of actual fire shattered morale before blades even crossed. The maw's operators leaned into the myth, timing bursts to coincide with thunderclaps during storms or echoing war drums, making the flames seem like the castle's own voice roaring defiance. After one failed siege, a chronicler wrote that the attackers fled not from men, but from the very breath of Satan himself. Yet while Malbork weaponized fire's primal terror, another fortress discovered how to turn something far more delicate into a weapon, not heat or stone, but sound itself. High in the Alps, the walls of Hohenwürfen Castle didn't just repel invaders, they sang them to their doom. Standing before the towering walls of a villa, besieging armies would hear it before they felt it, a low, persistent hum that seemed to come from the stones themselves. At first, soldiers might dismiss it as wind whistling through the battlements, but within hours, that sound would become their worst enemy. Medieval engineers here had perfected a form of acoustic warfare, embedding hollow chambers within the walls that amplified specific frequencies to devastating effect. Picture an attacking force camped outside the city, trying to rest before battle, only to be haunted by vibrations that made their teeth ache and their stomachs churn. The sound wasn't loud, it was insidious, slipping past armor and helmets to rattle the skull from the inside out. The genius of Avila's sonic walls lay in their precision. Each section was tuned to different frequencies, creating a disorienting soundscape that shifted as attackers moved along the perimeter. Some chambers emitted infrasound frequencies too low for human ears to consciously detect, yet proven to trigger primal unease. Soldiers would report sudden bouts of dread, their hands trembling on sword hilts for no apparent reason. Others produced audible tones that echoed off the surrounding hills, creating eerie harmonies that frayed nerves and shattered concentration. The effect was psychological torture on a grand scale, turning the very air into an accomplice of the defenders. But the true cruelty was reserved for cavalry. Certain wall segments were engineered to emit pulses that resonated with a horse's sensitive inner ear, sending these trained war animals into panicked bucking. Knights who had charged fearlessly into battle 100 times suddenly found their mounts rearing uncontrollably, throwing them into the dirt amid the chaos. Contemporary accounts describe entire cavalry units retreating in disgrace, their formation broken not by arrows or spears, but by an invisible force they couldn't fight. What made Avila's defenses so revolutionary was their sustainability. Unlike boiling oil or fire arrows that required constant replenishment, the sonic walls needed only the wind, or in some cases, teams of defenders rhythmically striking tuned stones to maintain their siege-breaking power. The system left no physical trace for attackers to study or counter, making it seem like the city was protected by sorcery. Even when armies eventually withdrew, the legend of those haunted walls spread far faster than any scout could ride, deterring future attacks before they began. Yet while Avila's engineers weaponized sound, others discovered how to turn a far more fundamental force against their enemies, not vibrations, but the relentless pull of gravity itself. The cliffs of Masada didn't just loom over attackers, they actively hunted them. Engineers here transformed the natural slope into a killing field, stockpiling hundreds of boulders along carefully calculated ledges. Picture an assault force scrambling up the narrow serpentine path, shields raised against arrows from above, when suddenly the mountainside itself seemed to shudder. With a single signal, defenders would release the rocks, sending them crashing downward in a thunderous avalanche. But these weren't random falls, each stone's path had been meticulously planned. Some boulders took direct routes, gaining terrifying speed to smash through armor like parchment. Others were deliberately angled to bounce off outcrops, veering unpredictably to strike clusters of soldiers who thought they'd found safe cover. The effect was chaos incarnate, turning what should have been an orderly advance into a desperate scramble where every footstep might trigger another deadly rain. What made Masada's rolling death so effective wasn't just the physics, it was the psychology. Engineers positioned certain rocks to create a cascading sequence where the initial impacts would dislodge secondary falls, prolonging the terror. Survivors described the sound as the mountain growling, an unnatural roar that preceded each fresh wave of destruction. The defenders didn't need complex machinery. Gravity did their work for them, and the steeper the slope, the more force each stone carried. Historical accounts tell of entire assault units abandoning their weapons to claw at the cliff face in panic, their formations shattered long before they reached the walls. Yet the true brilliance lay in the aftermath. After each assault, defenders could reset the trap with ease, collecting surviving boulders or quarrying new ones from the plateau above. Unlike boiling oil or fire arrows, this system never ran out of ammunition. The landscape itself replenished it, and when the dust settled, the scattered remains of siege ladders and broken armor served as grim warnings to the next wave of attackers. Masada proved that sometimes the simplest solutions were the most horrifying, turning geology into a weapon that required no maintenance, no supply lines, just a keen understanding of angles and human fear. But while Masada's defenders harnessed the raw power of falling stone, another city mastered something far more subtle, hiding their deadliest traps in the last place invaders would think to look. From the sky, Pomanova's perfect star shape might have looked like an architect's fantasy, but to any army foolish enough to attack, it quickly became a geometric nightmare. Every angle of those razor-straight walls served a deadly purpose, funneling invaders into invisible kill zones where crossfire from hidden gun ports would shred them before they even reached the gates. But the real horror wasn't what defenders could see, it was what they couldn't. Beneath the pristine streets, a web of tunnels pulsed like a hidden nervous system, connecting every artillery position in the city. Picture an attacking force dodging cannon fire from one bastion, only for those same guns to suddenly fall silent because the crews had already vanished underground, emerging moments later at a fresh battery on the opposite side of the fortress. The effect was like fighting a ghost artillery that could teleport at will. Pomanova's engineers didn't just build walls, they built illusions. The star shape wasn't just for show. Each pointed bastion created overlapping fields of fire, ensuring no attacker could approach without being exposed to at least two lethal angles. Even the cobblestones were part of the deception, subtly sloped to direct spilled blood away from defenders' footing, while channels beneath them carried away the screams of the wounded to unsettle fresh troops. But the masterstroke was in the tunnel's design, narrow enough to prevent cavalry charges yet wide enough to move cannons on hidden rails. They allowed defenders to concentrate firepower anywhere along the perimeter in minutes. An army might breach the outer wall at dawn, only to find the entire city's artillery waiting for them in a murderous semicircle by noon. What made Pomanova truly revolutionary was how it weaponized psychology. Attackers would spend weeks studying the fortress from afar, mapping what they thought were vulnerable points, never realizing the geometry itself was bait. Those invitingly straight avenues, deadly shooting galleries where every doorway concealed murder holes, those charming piazzas, giant kill boxes where defenders could rain down grenades from concealed rooftops. Even the city's famous central well wasn't just for water. It doubled as an echo chamber, amplifying the sounds of battle to disorient invaders. By the time armies realized they'd been herded like cattle, it was too late. Retreat paths were already sealed by rolling barricades disguised as market stalls. Yet while Pomanova's designers mastered the art of deception, others were perfecting a far more primal force, not geometry or tunnels, but the weather itself. High in the Alps, a fortress waited where the walls didn't just withstand storms, they commanded them. The towers of San Gimignano didn't just scrape the sky, they conducted the wind like a symphony of destruction. Between those soaring medieval spires, engineers carved narrow channels that transformed gentle breezes into screaming gales, funneling the air into concentrated jets capable of knocking armored knights clean off their feet. Picture an attacking force scaling the city walls at dusk, their torches flickering in the twilight, when suddenly an unnatural howl erupted from the stonework. In seconds, every flame would snuff out, plunging them into darkness as icy blasts sliced through gaps in their armor. The genius wasn't just in the wind's force, it was in its unpredictability. Some tunnels were angled to create sudden downdrafts that collapsed siege ladders like matchsticks, while others produced horizontal gusts strong enough to send arrows veering wildly off course, turning volleys into chaos. But the real cruelty lay in the waiting. Defenders could seal certain passages with hidden wooden shutters, allowing wind pressure to build until the moment attackers massed beneath the walls. With a single signal, guards would release the barriers, unleashing a concentrated shockwave that sounded like the earth itself roaring. Contemporary accounts describe men clutching their helmets as the tempest ripped cloaks from their backs, the very air becoming a weapon that left no blood but shattered morale completely. Even horses trained for the din of battle would rear in terror at these manufactured storms, their riders helpless against an enemy they couldn't strike. What made San Gimignano's wind tunnels revolutionary was their sustainability. Unlike boiling oil or fire arrows that required constant resupply, the system ran on nature itself. Engineers studied seasonal wind patterns for generations, mapping exactly which tunnels to open during summer siroccos or winter northerlies. The city's famous towers doubled as wind catchers, their heights creating pressure differentials that sucked air through the channels below with terrifying efficiency. And when the gales finally subsided, they left behind no trace, just invaders whispering of sorcery, their siege equipment scattered like dead leaves across the battlefield. Yet while San Gimignano's architects mastered the art of turning air into artillery, another fortress discovered how to weaponize something far more elusive, not wind, but the very ground beneath an enemy's feet. Beneath the rolling hills of Orvieto, engineers didn't just dig tunnels. They built a castle that could sink. Beneath the imposing walls of Spish Castle, the dungeon walls didn't just echo with screams, they rippled. Engineers here devised a punishment more cruel than chains or darkness. Cells that floated on the black waters of underground cisterns, their iron bars suspended just inches above the surface. Prisoners would wake to the splash of rising water against their toes, never knowing if this rainfall would be the one that finally submerged their cage. The genius of this torture wasn't in its brutality, but in its precision. Some cells were counterweighted to rise and fall with seasonal floods, ensuring captives spent winters shivering in chest-high icy water, then summers parched under dripping stone ceilings, their throats burning with thirst as water lapped just beyond reach. The psychological torment was calculated to the last drop. Guards could adjust water levels with hidden sluice gates, making cells sink slowly over hours to stretch the terror. Others were rigged to tilt unpredictably, forcing prisoners to constantly shift their weight to avoid slipping beneath the bars. Contemporary accounts describe captives losing track of time entirely, their world reduced to the rhythm of creaking chains and the endless gurgle of water rising through cracks in the floor. Even the castle's architects played their part, positioning certain cells beneath drainage spouts so sudden downpours would cascade directly onto the cages, simulating the horror of imminent drowning without ever delivering the final mercy. What made Spish floating dungeons truly sinister was their dual purpose. While breaking individual prisoners, they also served as a warning to besieging armies. Invaders who breached the outer walls might find their captured comrades displayed in these aquatic cells, visible through grates in the courtyard above. The sight of men half submerged in the gloom, their hollow eyes tracking every movement from below, did more to demoralize attackers than any volley of arrows. Some besieging forces reportedly withdrew entirely after hearing the splashes and moans echoing up from the ground, a sound one chronicler described as the castle itself weeping. Yet even this liquid cruelty paled in comparison to the artistry other cities applied to their defenses. Where Spish used water as a blunt instrument, master engineers elsewhere transformed their deadliest secrets into something resembling dark poetry, murder holes disguised as rose windows, collapsing bridges that fell like theater curtains, and towers that didn't just kill invaders, but performed their demise with chilling elegance. The vibrant frescoes adorning Siena's walls might have dazzled visitors with their biblical scenes and golden hues, but for invaders, these masterpieces hid a deadly secret. Behind the brushstrokes of angels and saints, narrow slits waited like sleeping vipers, their edges sharpened to guide crossbow bolts with chilling precision. Picture an attacking soldier pausing to admire what looks like a religious mural, only for a defender's arrow to suddenly pierce through the painted sky, striking with the unholy accuracy of divine judgment. The genius wasn't just in the concealment, it was in the psychology. Who would suspect the Virgin Mary's serene smile to split apart, revealing a murder hole pouring boiling oil? Some frescoes served double duty as reconnaissance tools. Delicate brushwork disguised peepholes where spies could track enemy movements, their views framed like living paintings of the carnage outside. One particularly clever mural near the city gates featured a trompe l'oeil window scene complete with painted curtains that could be pulled aside by defenders to expose the real killing field beyond. This fusion of artistry and lethality turned every alley into a potential death trap, where even admiring the architecture could prove fatal, but the true mastery lay in the timing. Defenders trained to strike during moments when invaders were most vulnerable, when a commander paused to study a fresco's details, or when troops clustered beneath a particularly splendid vault to escape the sun. The randomness of the attack spread paranoia, making every beautiful wall a potential assassin. Contemporary accounts describe besieging armies giving wide berth to even the most magnificent artworks, their commanders barking orders not to look upward. What made Siena's lethal frescoes revolutionary was their enduring power. Unlike temporary traps that could be disarmed or avoided, these defenses remained potent for centuries, their beauty disarming suspicion generation after generation. The city's artists became unsung tacticians, their pigments mixing with mortar to create something far more subversive than decoration, a lie so lovely, men walked willingly into its crosshairs. Yet while Siena turned art into armor, another city flipped the very concept of defense on its head, building its fortifications not to keep invaders out, but to lure them in. Beaumaris Castle's attackers learned the hard way that sometimes the best defense is turning your enemy's strength against them. Picture an invading army, confident in their towering siege engines, rolling these wooden giants toward the castle walls, only to watch in horror as defenders suddenly seized control of them. With a few swift maneuvers, the very weapons meant to smash Beaumaris apart were swung around, now raining destruction back on their creators. The irony was brutal. An army that had come to besiege found itself besieged by its own tools. But the real stroke of genius lay in Beaumaris's concentric walls. These weren't just layered defenses, they were a geometric trap. The inner and outer battlements created overlapping kill zones where retreating soldiers found themselves pinched between two relentless waves of arrows. Crossbowmen on the higher inner walls could pick off stragglers trying to flee, while archers on the outer ramparts cut down anyone who hesitated. The castle's design eliminated blind spots, ensuring every inch of ground was covered by multiple angles of fire. Attackers who breached the first gate didn't find safety. They stepped into a shooting gallery where every exit was a dead end. What made Beaumaris a masterclass in defensive warfare wasn't just its physical structure, but its psychological warfare. Defenders didn't just capture siege engines, they taunted the attackers with them, lobbing stones back with deliberate slowness to amplify the humiliation. The message was clear: every resource brought against this castle would only feed its strength. Contemporary chronicles describe besieging armies abandoning their camps in disarray, their morale shattered not by superior numbers, but by the sheer audacity of a fortress that refused to play by the rules of siegecraft. Yet even as Beaumaris redefined defense, other medieval engineers were looking beyond stone and steel for inspiration. Why build traps when nature itself could be weaponized? Up next, the bizarre and brilliant ways castles turned wildlife into their deadliest allies. At the Alhambra, invaders quickly learned that the fortress's most terrifying defenders weren't the armored soldiers on its walls. They were the tens of thousands of furious bees waiting in the shadows. Hidden throughout the palace complex, clay pipes led to concealed chambers where hives of Africanized honeybees hummed in restless anticipation. The moment attackers breached the outer defenses, guards would pull levers, releasing these living weapons through narrow tubes, sending swirling clouds of stinging fury pouring into the corridors. Picture armored knights suddenly dropping their swords to claw at their faces as bees found every gap in their visors, their screams muffled by the deafening buzz filling the air. But the true genius of Alhambra's bee warfare lay in its adaptability. Some hives were positioned to flood specific courtyards, creating no-go zones where invaders would retreat in blind panic. Others connected to angled pipes that funneled the insects directly onto scaling ladders, sending entire assault teams tumbling backward in agony. The most feared tactic, though, was the bee catapult, specially designed baskets that could fling entire hives hundreds of feet into enemy camps. These airborne assaults transformed disciplined siege preparations into scenes of utter madness, as soldiers abandoned their posts to flee from an enemy that couldn't be fought with swords or shields. What made the bees so devastating wasn't just the physical pain, it was the psychological torment. Unlike arrows or boiling oil, the insects seemed to attack with malicious intelligence, seeking out eyes and exposed skin with horrifying precision. Chroniclers of failed sieges wrote of grown men weeping as they fled, their faces swollen beyond recognition, while others plunged into rivers to escape, only to drown under the weight of their armor. The Alhambra's keepers took cruel advantage of this terror, sometimes releasing a single hive first as a warning, letting the screams of the stung deter fresh waves of attackers before they even approached the walls. Yet perhaps the most ingenious aspect was the system's sustainability. While other defenses required constant resupply, the bees replenished themselves, their hives growing stronger with each season. Defenders even cultivated specific flowers along the fortress walls to keep the colonies thriving, turning the Alhambra's famous gardens into both a weapon and a disguise. To this day, historians debate whether the palace's reputation as a paradise was carefully crafted to conceal its deadliest secret, that behind every blooming rose and trickling fountain lay the potential for nature's most painful wrath. But while the Alhambra turned insects into instruments of war, another fortress discovered how to manipulate something far more fundamental, not living creatures, but the very fabric of reality itself. In the shadow of the Pyrenees, engineers built walls that defied not just armies but physics. Hohenwürfen castles killing fields looked deceptively ordinary until the ground itself reached up to claim its victims. Engineers here mastered a form of invisible warfare, sculpting the earth into slopes so precise they defied human instinct. Picture an attacker edging forward, shield raised against arrows, utterly unaware that the gentle incline beneath his boots was a death sentence in disguise. The angles were calculated to the very degree where even a cautious step could send a fully armored knight sliding uncontrollably toward hidden pits. These weren't just holes in the ground, they were mathematical traps, their sides polished smooth to prevent any hope of clawing back to safety. The true horror lay in the deception. From a distance, the terrain appeared perfectly navigable, with no obvious trenches or spikes to avoid. But once an advancing force crossed an invisible threshold, gravity took over. Soldiers would suddenly find their feet slipping out from under them, their armor becoming a deadly weight as they careened into pits lined with jagged stakes. Some slopes were even designed to work in tandem. A slight misstep on one would send a man tumbling sideways into another, creating a domino effect of falling bodies. Contemporary accounts describe entire assault units vanishing in moments, their screams cut short as the earth itself seemed to swallow them whole. What made Hohenwürfen's gravity well so psychologically devastating was their silence. Unlike boiling oil or collapsing walls, these traps gave no warning. No creaking mechanisms, no shouted commands, just the sickening slide of metal on stone, followed by the wet crunch of impact. Defenders could watch from the safety of the walls as entire battalions unraveled, their formations dissolving into chaos without a single arrow being loosed. The wells never ran out of ammunition, never needed reloading. They simply waited, patient as the mountains themselves, for the next wave of invaders to misjudge a single step. Yet the castle's engineers didn't stop at physics, they weaponized perception itself. Certain pits were dug just shallow enough to maim rather than kill, leaving wounded soldiers to writhe in agony as a warning to their comrades. Others were positioned where retreating forces would naturally flee, turning desperation into a death sentence. The most cunning wells of all, those left conspicuously uncovered after a siege, their grisly contents displayed like a merchant's wares, a silent advertisement to deter future attackers. But while Hohenwürfen turned the earth into a collaborator, other medieval strongholds discovered how to manipulate something even more unexpected: their own beauty. Beyond the castle walls, perfectly manicured gardens weren't just for leisure. They were camouflage for some of history's most ingenious battlefield deceptions. The gardens of Villandry Castle looked like something from a medieval painter's dream: neatly clipped hedges, vibrant flower beds, and trellises heavy with ripe fruit. But for invaders who stumbled into this paradise, beauty was the first layer of a carefully constructed nightmare. Beneath the fragrant blossoms, defenders had cultivated a botanical arsenal: wolfsbane hidden among the violets, deadly nightshade twining through the rose bushes, and water hemlock growing lush along the stream banks where thirsty soldiers might kneel to drink. Every serene pathway was a potential death trap, every tempting berry a gamble with death. The true horror of Villandry's gardens wasn't just the poison, it was the artistry of its deployment. Defenders trained for years to master the subtle choreography of leading enemies deeper into the greenery, feigning retreat through arches draped in flowering honeysuckle, only to vanish into hidden passages, leaving bewildered attackers surrounded by foliage that could kill with a touch. Some fruits were deliberately injected with toxins, their perfect exteriors masking flesh that could paralyze a grown man in minutes. Even the castle's famed herb garden doubled as a laboratory, where apothecaries distilled tinctures to coat arrowheads or lace the rims of offered wine cups. But the most insidious weapon was patience. Unlike boiling oil or collapsing bridges, Villandry's botanical traps worked slowly. A soldier might pluck a handful of cherries to quiet his hunger, only to collapse hours later in his camp, his comrades never connecting his agony to the idyllic garden they'd passed through. Others brushed against seemingly harmless leaves, unaware they'd encountered giant hogweed until blisters erupted across their skin under the sunlight. The delayed reaction sowed paranoia, making invaders distrust even the air they breathed. Yet the garden's cruelest trick was their duality. While invaders died choking on belladonna berries, defenders harvested the same plants to heal their own wounded, turning poison into medicine with a herbalist's precision. This blurring of boundaries between remedy and weapon made Villandry's defenses impossible to dismantle. An army might torch the gardens, only to realize too late that the smoke itself carried toxic spores. While Villandry turned nature into a silent assassin, another fortress discovered how to weaponize something far more intangible, not plants or poison, but time itself. In the shadow of the Alps, engineers built a clock that didn't just tell time, it stole it. The massive gates of Mdina didn't just bar entry, they played a cruel game of timing with invaders' lives. Imagine an attacking force surging through the outer gatehouse, only to hear an ominous scraping of stone behind them as the entrance slammed shut with finality. Ahead, the second gate remained tantalizingly open, beckoning them forward into the narrow passage. This was no oversight, it was temporal warfare, where every footstep ticked closer to catastrophe. Hidden in guard towers above, defenders monitored intricate water clocks and sand timers, their hands poised to release counterweights that would seal the inner gate at unpredictable intervals. The result, entire battalions trapped like rats in a stone tunnel, their triumphant charge suddenly transformed into a panicked scramble as murder holes above rained death from all sides. What made Mdina's hourglass gate so devastating was their psychological precision. Engineers didn't use regular intervals, they created erratic patterns that defied human anticipation. Some sequences allowed just enough time for the vanguard to pass before crushing the main force, splitting armies in two. Others held open just long enough to lure in scouts before snapping shut to isolate them. The defenders trained for years to internalize these rhythms, developing an almost musical sense for when to spring the trap. Contemporary accounts describe invaders freezing mid-step, paralyzed by the sound of grinding gears echoing through the passageways, never knowing if this creak signaled their doom or temporary reprieve. The true genius lay in the gate's silent accomplices, specially designed grooves in the stone floor that amplified the sound of approaching footsteps. Guards could estimate the size of an invading force by the vibrations traveling through these acoustic channels, adjusting their timing accordingly. Larger groups might trigger a delayed closure, letting more enemies enter the kill zone before sealing their fate. Smaller, nimbler strike teams could find themselves racing against gates that snapped shut with alarming speed, turning what should have been a tactical advantage into a death sentence. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect was how Mdina's engineers weaponized hope itself. Certain gates were designed to close almost completely before jamming deliberately, leaving a finger's width gap, just enough for desperate invaders to glimpse freedom on the other side. This visual torment stretched the psychological agony, as soldiers wasted precious moments trying to pry apart stones that wouldn't budge, their backs exposed to arrows pouring from above. By the time they realized the gap was a cruel illusion, the killing floor would already be slick with their comrades' blood. While Mdina mastered the art of temporal traps, other medieval strongholds discovered how to manipulate light itself, not just as illumination, but as a blazing weapon that could turn mirrors into missiles and sunlight into searing punishment. At Aigues Mortes, the noonday sun didn't just illuminate the battlefield, it became one. High atop the fortress walls, ranks of polished bronze mirrors stood like silent sentinels, their surfaces angled with mathematical precision to focus sunlight into searing lances of heat. Picture an invading army advancing under clear skies, their siege towers creaking forward, when suddenly the air itself seemed to catch fire. Beams of concentrated light swept across the field like divine wrath, igniting wooden structures in seconds and sending men scrambling to tear off smoldering cloaks. The mirrors weren't static. Defenders could pivot them on hidden gears, transforming the reflections into a disorienting strobe that flickered across the dust-choked battlefield, turning orderly formations into chaos. The genius of Aigues Mortes' solar arsenal lay in its simplicity. Unlike boiling oil or catapults that required constant resupply, the mirrors drew power from an inexhaustible source, the sun itself. Engineers calibrated each reflector to specific angles, creating overlapping zones of destruction where temperatures could reach over 1,000 degrees. Some mirrors were tuned to wider focal points, bathing entire platoons in blistering heat that forced them to abandon formation. Others concentrated their beams into needle-thin rays capable of punching through armor, leaving behind tiny, smoldering holes that betrayed no visible wound until the wearer collapsed minutes later from internal burns. But the true horror wasn't just the physical damage, it was the psychological unraveling. Soldiers raised shields against arrows, but how did one block daylight? The beams left no shadows to warn of their path, striking with the randomness of lightning. Contemporary accounts describe warhorses bolting in terror as their bridles burst into flames, and seasoned knights dropping their swords to claw at their helmets, convinced molten metal was dripping onto their faces. Even the mirror's silence amplified the terror. No twang of bowstrings or roar of catapults, just the sickening hiss of cooking flesh and the panicked cries of men who'd never trained to fight the sky itself. What made Moat's death rays truly revolutionary was their adaptability. On cloudy days, defenders could reposition the mirrors to act as blinding devices, flashing intense reflections into attackers' eyes from multiple directions, rendering them temporarily sightless amid the chaos of battle. Some were even mounted on rolling platforms, allowing crews to shift their angles as the sun moved, maintaining relentless pressure until dusk provided the only possible respite. The system required no ammunition, left no physical trace for historians to later study, and spawned legends of a fortress wielding the Sword of Apollo, a myth its defenders happily encouraged. Yet while Moat turned sunlight into a weapon, another fortress discovered how to harness something far more elusive, not light, but belief itself. Beyond these gleaming mirrors lay a stronghold where engineers didn't just build walls, they crafted an entire mythology to make their defenses invincible. The moment invaders stepped into Pajama Castle's shadowy corridors, they weren't just battling soldiers, they were fighting ghosts. Engineers here weaponized the very air, carving whisper galleries into the limestone cliffs that amplified even the faintest sigh into a chorus of spectral voices. Picture armored knights creeping through a passageway, their torches flickering when suddenly the walls began to murmur, not in any language they recognized, but in eerie, disjointed syllables that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Defenders, hidden in narrow side tunnels, would drag rusted chains across stone or blow through hollow reeds, creating sounds that twisted and multiplied as they bounced through the cavernous halls. The effect was calculated terror, grown men dropping their weapons to clutch at holy symbols, convinced they'd trespassed into some unholy threshold between worlds. But the castle's true genius lay in its staged theatrics. Certain chambers held shallow pools of water, positioned to reflect torchlight in wavering patterns that danced along the ceilings like phantom flames. Others concealed small mirrors angled to catch moonlight, projecting sudden, ghostly apparitions onto distant walls. The most terrifying trick, a network of counterweighted stones that defenders could release to produce thunderous booms deep within the mountain, mimicking the sound of giants pounding on the earth's doors. Contemporary accounts describe besiegers fleeing in panic after witnessing the very rocks howling, their superstitions weaponized against them with chilling precision. Yet Pajama's psychological warfare didn't stop at sound and light. Some passageways were designed to amplify the castle's natural drafts, creating icy gusts that snuffed out torches without warning. Others featured false dead ends that forced invaders to retrace their steps only to find familiar corridors now eerily altered, with previously solid walls suddenly gaping open like maws. The defenders leaned hard into the legend, dressing in pale cloth to flit through peripheral visions before vanishing into hidden crevices. By the time attackers reached the inner keep, if they reached it at all, their nerves were so frayed that a single dropped pebble could send them fleeing back into the night. What made Prajama's haunted halls so effective was their plausibility. Unlike crude scare tactics, these illusions played on universal medieval fears: the dread of restless spirits, the terror of divine judgment, the primal unease of darkness that seemed alive. Engineers didn't just exploit superstition, they sculpted it, turning the castle's natural acoustics and geology into a stage for nightmares. And when survivors stumbled back to their camps with tales of cursed stones and whispering walls, the stories spread faster than any scout could ride, deterring future attacks before they began. Yet while Prajama's defenders conjured ghosts, other cities discovered that the dead could serve a far more practical purpose, not as specters, but as silent sentinels woven into the very fabric of their fortifications. The stench of rotting flesh hung thick over Monte Cassino's walls, but it wasn't just the smell that shattered besieging armies. It was the sight of their own fallen comrades soaring back toward them through the air. Hidden behind the abbey's battlements, defenders loaded trebuchets not with stones, but with corpses rigged to unleash fresh horrors upon impact. Some bodies burst mid-flight, showering the enemy ranks with disease-ridden viscera. Others landed with a sickening thud among living soldiers, only to explode moments later as hidden incendiary pouches ignited. This wasn't just psychological warfare, it was biological terror, turning death itself into a weapon that kept giving. Monte Cassino's engineers elevated cruelty to an art form. Certain cadavers were deliberately left to fester for days before launch, ensuring they carried plagues to enemy camps. Others were stuffed with quicklime, so when they split open on impact, the caustic powder would blind and choke survivors. The genius lay in the unpredictability. Attackers never knew whether the next dark shape arcing through the sky would land inert or detonate in a fireball. Contemporary chronicles describe besiegers abandoning their positions not from wounds, but from the sheer horror of watching their own friends' remains used as ammunition, their identities often still recognizable despite decomposition. But the true mastery was in the timing. Defenders waited for precise moments when enemy troops clustered for meals or mass, maximizing the terror's reach. Some trebuchets were angled to skip corpses across crowded encampments like gruesome stones across a pond. Others lofted their payloads high to strike command tents with macabre precision. The effect wasn't just physical, it unraveled the very fabric of military discipline. Soldiers began refusing to retrieve their dead, fearing they'd become the next projectiles. Others deserted rather than face the nightmare of fighting an enemy that refused to let even death end the battle. What made Monte Cassino's corpse catapults so devastating was their dual assault on body and mind. While spreading disease through contaminated wounds, they also eroded the sacred rituals of burial, a profound psychological blow in medieval warfare. Survivors brought home not just tales of defeat, but of a place where the normal rules of combat and mortality no longer applied. The Abbey's defenders understood something modern militaries still grapple with. Sometimes the most effective weapons aren't those that kill, but those that make the living wish they were dead. Yet while Monte Cassino weaponized the dead, another city discovered how to turn destruction itself into defense. Beyond these haunted battlements lay a stronghold that didn't just withstand ruin, it thrived on it. The battlefield at Hattin looked like a graveyard of broken walls and shattered towers, but for the invading army, this was no accident of war. It was a meticulously staged massacre waiting to happen. Defenders had spent weeks secretly undermining their own structures, carefully propping them up with timbers soaked in animal fat. When the enemy surged forward, lured by the promise of easy conquest through these collapsed defenses, a single flaming arrow would send the whole charade up in flames. The ground itself seemed to erupt as support beams burned away, dropping tons of stone onto soldiers who never saw the real trap, the network of fire pits concealed beneath the rubble. But the true cruelty of Hatton's ruin traps lay in their delayed horror. As choking dust filled the air, survivors staggering through the wreckage would suddenly feel the ground give way beneath their boots. What looked like solid debris concealed hollow chambers where archers crouched in stifling darkness, their crossbows trained upward through narrow slits. These hidden killers didn't need to aim the collapsing floors above funneled victims directly into their line of fire like fish swimming into a net. Contemporary accounts describe men plunging through false rubble only to find themselves impaled mid-fall, their dying screams echoing through stone tunnels designed to amplify every sound of agony. The engineers behind this nightmare mastered the art of misdirection. Some pits were layered with dry tinder that ignited from the initial collapse, creating secondary explosions to panic those who avoided the first disaster. Others featured false ceilings that crumbled in stages, herding survivors toward ever narrower kill zones where the last standing would find themselves backlit by flames, perfect targets for the archers waiting in the shadows. Even the rubble patterns were deliberate, with larger stones positioned to create makeshift ramps that slid fleeing soldiers back into the inferno. What made Hatton's ruins so psychologically devastating was their aftermath. Unlike clean battlefield deaths, these traps left invaders with grotesque choices: burn alive in the open or risk the arrows waiting underground. Those who escaped brought back tales of a fortress that fought on even in destruction, its very ruins thirsting for blood. And when the fires finally died, the smoldering wreckage stood as a warning. In medieval warfare, sometimes the safest-looking path was the deadliest of all. Yet while Hatton's engineers turned collapse into a weapon, others discovered how to manipulate something far more intangible, not stone or fire, but the very absence of sound. In the cliffs of Meteora, defenders built a fortress where silence didn't just conceal their movements, it became a blade sharper than any sword. The defenders of Montsegur didn't just fight their enemies, they vanished from their senses. In the dead of night, when besieging armies strained to hear any hint of movement behind the castle walls, they were met with something far worse than the clash of steel: utter silence. Every hammer strike against stone was muffled by wool-wrapped mallets. Every footstep glided across straw-lined walkways. Even the swords of patrolling guards were sheathed in layers of felt, turning what should have been the metallic whisper of drawn blades into nothingness. This wasn't just stealth, it was sensory deprivation on a scale medieval minds couldn't comprehend. Imagine standing watch in that besieging camp, the moon casting long shadows across the silent fortress. No creak of gates, no shouted orders, not even the distant murmur of voices. Just the wind and your own heartbeat growing louder in your ears. Then, without warning, a sentry vanishes from his post, plucked from the darkness without a cry. Another hour passes, another man disappears. By dawn, the remaining guards are wild-eyed, swinging at shadows, convinced the castle isn't defended by men at all, but by spirits who move through walls. The genius of Montsegur's silent defense wasn't in the kills themselves, but in the gaps between them, the agonizing stretches of uncertainty that frayed nerves to breaking point. Historical accounts describe besiegers abandoning their positions not from wounds, but from the unbearable tension. Some swore they saw shapes moving along the battlements, only to blink and find the walls empty again. Others, driven to madness by sleepless nights, attacked their own allies in the fog, mistaking whispers for enemy conspirators. The castle's defenders understood a fundamental truth of warfare: the human mind fears the unknown far more than any blade. By stripping away the familiar soundtrack of siege, the clatter of armor, the drum of footsteps, they turned the mundane into the supernatural. Yet Montsega's most chilling innovation wasn't the silence itself, it was how they weaponized expectation. Defenders occasionally allowed a single sound to escape, the distant scrape of a chair, the faintest cough echoing from a tower. These breadcrumbs of noise were deliberately placed, luring attackers into ambushes where the sudden return of silence signaled the traps springing. Soldiers who charged toward a ringing anvil would find the courtyard abandoned, the sound source gone, just in time for the real attack to come from behind. What made this tactic so devastating was its invisibility. Unlike boiling oil or collapsing bridges, Montsega's defense left no physical trace. There were no charred bodies or shattered siege engines to rally against, just missing comrades and the creeping suspicion that the castle itself was alive. By the time commanders realized the truth, their armies were often too demoralized to continue. The lesson was clear: in warfare, sometimes the most terrifying weapon isn't what you hear, it's what you don't. Yet while Montséga mastered the art of silent terror, our final marvel takes psychological warfare to its most surreal extreme. Beyond these hushed battlements lies a fortress where the walls didn't just confuse invaders, they laughed at them. The walls of Chester didn't just rain arrows or boiling oil. They unleashed a weapon so absurd, so stomach-churning, that even the most battle-hardened warriors fled in retching disgust: rotting cheese. Historical chronicles describe defenders loading trebuchets with wheels of aged, maggot-infested dairy, launching these putrid projectiles into besieging camps with pinpoint accuracy. Imagine the scene: a barrage of fermented cheddar soaring through the air, splattering across armor with a wet thud, releasing a stench so potent it clung to skin and fabric for weeks. The effect wasn't just nausea, it was psychological warfare. Soldiers gagged, their eyes watering, their weapons slipping from hands slick with vomit. The stench permeated everything: food stores, water supplies, even the very air they breathed, turning orderly camps into scenes of wretched chaos. But the genius of Chester's cheese cannon wasn't just in its repulsion, it was in its ruthless efficiency. Unlike finite supplies of arrows or oil, cheese was readily available, easily stockpiled, and grew more effective as it decayed. Some accounts suggest defenders mixed quicklime into the curds, creating a caustic paste that burned skin on contact. Others describe hollowed-out rounds stuffed with rags soaked in vinegar or sulfur, ensuring the odor lingered like a toxic fog. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Attackers who'd faced boiling tar and flying boulders found themselves utterly unprepared for the humiliation of being routed by dairy. Chroniclers of failed sieges wrote of men stripping off their armor mid-assault, preferring to face arrows naked than endure another whiff of that cloying, rotten stink. What made this tactic so chillingly effective was its duality. It weaponized both biology and shame. The ammonia-rich fumes triggered involuntary bodily reactions, rendering even the strongest warriors helpless. But worse was the ridicule. Surviving soldiers returned home not with tales of glorious combat, but of being bested by what amounted to medieval trash. Chester's defenders understood something modern militaries still grapple with. Sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't those that kill, but those that strip enemies of dignity. The cheese cannon wasn't just a desperate last resort, it was a masterstroke of asymmetric warfare, proving that in the right hands, even the most mundane objects could become siege-breaking tools. And yet, for all their brilliance, these marvels of military engineering gradually faded from memory, buried by time, shifting battlefields, and the relentless march of progress. Why? Perhaps because their very success made them obsolete. Fortresses so impregnable were rarely attacked, their secrets untested for generations. Or maybe because the rise of gunpowder rendered many techniques archaic, turning cunning traps into quaint relics. But the most poignant reason might be simpler. History favors the visible. We remember towering castles, not the hidden gears that made them deadly. We chronicle kings and battles, not the nameless engineers who turned physics, chemistry, and psychology into art. These forgotten marvels whisper a truth we've overlooked. The Middle Ages weren't just an era of brute force. They were a laboratory of human ingenuity, where survival hinged on outthinking as much as outlasting. From cheese cannons to gravity traps, these were solutions born not from abundance, but from scarcity, proof that necessity doesn't just mother invention, it forges brilliance. So the next time you walk through a medieval city's cobbled streets, remember, beneath your feet lies not just stone, but the echoes of minds that refuse to accept the impossible. Their legacy isn't just in what they built, but in the boundless creativity they unleashed upon the world. These 30 military engineering marvels shatter the myth of the medieval world as a primitive backwater, revealing instead a golden age of innovation where necessity didn't just birth invention, but outright genius. Consider the sheer breadth of knowledge these anonymous engineers wielded. They manipulated hydraulics with precision we'd struggle to achieve without computers, designed psychological traps that still inform modern warfare, and mastered materials science centuries before the periodic table existed. Their creations weren't just functional, they were elegant solutions to existential threats, where every stone, every channel of water, every whisper in a tunnel served a deadly purpose. What's most astonishing isn't just their technical prowess, it's how these innovations reflect a deep understanding of human nature. The architects of places like Prajama Castle didn't just build walls, they crafted experiences, weaponizing fear, disorientation, and even shame centuries before psychology became a science. The floating dungeons of Spish didn't merely punish, they staged horror shows to break the morale of entire armies. And let's not forget the cheese cannons of Chester, proving humor could be as lethal as any blade when deployed with enough creativity. Yet for all their sophistication, these marvels remain largely forgotten, overshadowed by castles and cathedrals while the real masterpieces hide in plain sight. Maybe that's the ultimate testament to their brilliance. The best defenses weren't just invisible, they were unthinkable. Even now, archaeologists stumble upon new discoveries, a hidden sluice gate in Carcasson's tunnels, another mirrored death ray at Aigues Mortes, proving we've only scratched the surface. So the next time you stroll through a medieval city square, pause for a moment. That cobblestone beneath your foot, it might conceal a murder hole, that charming well. Possibly an acoustic spy chamber. These engineers didn't just defend cities, they blurred the line between architecture and artistry, leaving behind puzzles we're still unraveling. Which of these revelations left you awestruck? Was it the floating dungeons, the singing walls of Avila, or the sheer audacity of the bee catapults? Drop your thoughts below, and if you've enjoyed this dive into history's hidden genius, hit subscribe. Because somewhere out there, another forgotten marvel waits to be unearthed, and we'll be there to bring its secrets to light.